Welcome to Shadow Evidence, where every case is steeped in whispers of truth and silence of deceit. Tonight we step into Oxford's heart, where the ancient dome of the Radcliffe camera hides more than books within its stone embrace. A scholar lies dead, and the echo of secrets stirs among manuscripts and cloisters. What hidden pact, what unspoken betrayal threads its way through the quiet corridors of learning? Before we begin the mystery, tell me, where in the world are you joining us from? If mysteries cloaked in shadow intrigue you, like this video and subscribe to join the investigation. Now, light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. There are certain afternoons in Oxford when the air itself seems weighted with memory, as if every stone, every crooked rainpipe has absorbed the sighs of centuries and keeps them close. I remember such a day late in October when the first true cold had crept into the city, and the yellowed plane leaves lay plastered like half-read notes across the pavements. The Radcliffe camera, solemn as ever, stood ringed by bicycles that no one loved enough to oil, their chains whispering in rust whenever the wind picked at them. I had drifted there without a plan. It is one of my less admirable qualities, that capacity to roam the city under the pretense of thought, when really it is an escape from the barrenness of my own rooms. A crossword was folded in my coat pocket, its corners fraying with damp. The clue that resisted me, something about circles, eternity, secrets, kept looping in my mind like a tune misremembered. I stood beneath the dome, listening to the faint echo of my own shoes on the flagstones, and wondered if the word was simple and I was merely reluctant to see it. A man passed me, one of those lecturers whose name I never properly retained. We exchanged the brief nod that academics and policemen alike cultivate, the nod that carries just enough recognition to forestall conversation. Yet he slowed, muttered almost to himself that there had been some trouble in the library. Nothing more. He vanished into the drizzle with his gown flapping like an abandoned sail. Trouble in the library. The phrase lodged itself with irritating permanence, like a word you cannot dislodge from the back of the throat. I told myself it was nothing, of course. The Bodleian has survived revolutions, purges, and every eccentricity the scholars could fling at it. What fresh mischief could rattle its shelves now? Still I lingered. The camera windows glowed faintly with lamps already lit against the gloom, and I caught myself imagining the smell within. Dust, vellum, the faint metallic tang of ink, rubbed thin by centuries of use. There are worse places for a man to waste his life than among unread books. By instinct, rather than design, I wandered toward Broad Street. The air smelled of rain on coal smoke. Students hurried past in twos and threes, voices high with laughter that carried more defiance than joy. I envied them, though I could not say why. Perhaps because they still believed the city's beauty belonged to them, and not merely to their memories. I settled in the King's Arms, where the carpet smelt of beer, more ancient than some of the patrons. I sat in my accustomed corner, half hidden by the curve of the wall, and unfolded the crossword again. A pint of bitter at my elbow, the clue staring at me like an adversary who knew my weakness. Circles conceal what is eternal. 5 letters. I penciled in the obvious answer, then rubbed it out, dissatisfied. Truth rarely accepts the obvious. At the next table, 2 undergraduates debated whether Milton had erred in Paradise Lost by granting Satan the finer speeches. Their voices rose, broke off in sudden embarrassment, then continued in quieter defiance. I thought of how many dons, how many judges had begun their public lives in such arguments, and how many scandals had ended them. Human folly seems to trace a circle of its own. I will not pretend that I foresaw anything of consequence that afternoon. At best, there was a sense of something faintly out of tune, like a chord struck wrong at the close of a symphony. Trouble in the library. A don whose face I could barely recall, muttering words I could not quite dismiss, the crossword clue refusing to yield, and the peculiar stillness that settles over Oxford just before a storm of any kind, meteorological or otherwise. As I left the pub, evening sliding across the roofs, I glanced once more toward the camera. Its dome loomed against the darkening sky, a lantern of secrecy. The bells began their solemn marking of the hour, and I thought again of circles, of time, of the futility of believing anything remains hidden for long in this city. Even then, some part of me knew the trouble in the library would not rest. And the answer, when it came, would not be 5 letters, but a lifetime. It was Lewis who brought me the news, though the words seemed to sit uneasily in his mouth, as if he had been made the reluctant messenger of something better left unsaid. We were standing under the dripping eaves of the police station, the morning already half consumed by rain. He said that Dr. Alistair Greening had been found in the Radcliffe camera, in one of the smaller reading rooms kept for rare folios. The tone was plain enough, but I could see the faint contraction around his eyes. Sudden death, he added. Heart failure, most likely. Yet the phrasing of it suggested more than medicine. Greening. The name was familiar, though like so many Oxford names it floated in the mind without shape. I remembered a lean man, spectacles glinting under the dome lights, once encountered at a college dinner, where I drank too much and left too early. He was the sort of scholar who seemed stitched from silence itself. The thought of him slumped in one of those hard, wooden chairs, life suddenly gone from his veins, was curiously disturbing. I walked over to the camera that afternoon, not out of duty so much as compulsion. The circular walls seemed to draw me inward, as though the building itself conspired to conceal something in its embrace. A constable stood at the gate, uneasy in his role as guardian of ancient books. Inside, the air smelled of stone made damp with centuries, and beneath that the dry perfume of parchment. One cannot mistake the sound of a library at half attendance, the muffled coughs, the shifting of pages, the creak of boots trying to tread softly. Yet that day there was an added weight, as though the very volumes had absorbed the scandal of death and were unwilling to release it. The reading room was dim. On the table lay a cluster of objects which, to another eye, might have seemed irrelevant. A misshelved folio, spine cracked where careless hands had pressed too firmly. A wine stain, faint but visible, on the blotting paper. An access register, with the last 3 names written in ink that had not yet dried. My gaze lingered longest on the blot, irregular in its shape. Someone had signed in with haste, perhaps even irritation. In the smallest details, impatience betrays itself. Lewis followed me in, shifting his weight, reluctant to disturb the hush. He muttered that the doctor had no known illnesses, though he was in his late 50s, and solitude can be as ruinous to the heart as tobacco. Natural causes, he said again, as if repetition might make the verdict credible. But he could not keep the question from his tone. Why here? Why now in this cloistered room, so rarely visited? I found myself staring at the shelves where the folio had been taken. Latin, mostly, sermons and disputations that no student would willingly consult. Yet the volume's absence had been noted, if only by the ghost of dust left behind. I bent, rubbed my finger against the wood, and thought of the crossword clue still folded in my pocket. What circles conceal? The camera was nothing if not a circle, holding within it the secrets of centuries. A librarian approached, a woman in her 40s, precise in movement, her hands as careful as a surgeon's. She said that Dr. Greening had lately been requesting access to materials beyond his usual field, astronomy, obscure pamphlets, and even personal correspondence are stored among the restricted collections. She lowered her voice, as if to confess that he seemed unsettled in recent weeks. I asked her what she meant by unsettled. She hesitated, then said only that he read the same letter twice, as though searching for a different meaning each time. That stayed with me. Outside, the bells began their quarter-hour chiming, indifferent as always to the small tragedies beneath them. I closed the register and felt the damp ink mark against my thumb. A trivial detail, perhaps, but I have learned that lives unravel most easily from the smallest thread. I left the camera with the rain heavier now, dripping from the gargoyles like a slow applause. The official word would be heart, failure, and many would accept it. Yet I knew, as surely as I knew the taste of whiskey waiting in my cupboard, that the trouble in the library had only begun. If Oxford has perfected anything, it is the art of appearances, respectability in the daylight, whispered grudges in the dark. Greening's death had left the dons restless, though they wore their unease like a borrowed gown, elegant but ill-fitting. I walked among them in those first days, as if through a gallery of portraits, each face polished for public view, each expression betraying some minor crack when the gaze lingered too long. The first was Clara Ashbury, the librarian who had spoken to me in hushed tones beside the camera shelves. I returned to her that morning, the rain still glossing the cobbles outside. She received me in her office, a narrow chamber lined with catalogues more meticulously ordered than her own composure. She told me she had known Greening for years, that he was punctilious, aloof, and occasionally sharp in manner. There was a pause, though, before she added affectionate. A pause that carried more meaning than the word itself. I watched her fingers adjust the edge of a blotter already squared to the desk. She did not meet my eye when she asked whether the police considered the death suspicious. I replied with a sort of vagueness that has the advantage of being honest, perhaps. Professor Dacre was of another breed entirely. Where Clara had kept her feelings in check, Dacre seemed incapable of silence. His lecture room was still heavy with chalk dust when I approached him, the air sharp with the faint sting of lime. He greeted me with a performance of concern, lamenting the loss of a colleague whose brilliance, he claimed, had never been fully appreciated. Yet when I pressed on Greening's recent researches, those unusual excursions into fields far from his own, Dacre's eloquence faltered. He adjusted his cuff, the pause barely half a breath, but enough for me to sense irritation behind the mask. He spoke of scholarly duty, of intellectual curiosity. Yet I thought of my crossword clue from that morning, one about masks concealing what they cannot change. I penciled in the answer later: facade. Edward Fenton was the youngest of them, though not young enough to be forgiven for the carelessness etched into his manner. He met me at his college rooms, the curtains drawn against the dull sky, the smell of stale tobacco heavy on the air. A bottle lay open on the mantelpiece, the kind of brandy purchased more for its label than its quality. He laughed too easily, protested too quickly that he had hardly known the man. Yet he betrayed himself when I asked about Greening's habits in the camera. His eyes slid away with the instinct of a liar not yet practiced enough to conceal it. He recovered, of course, talking about debt, about students, about the tedium of committee meetings, but the slip remained. And then Margaret Vale, she invited me to her house, on the edge of North Oxford, a red-bricked facade softened by ivy and time. She was elegance itself, though her eyes carried the faint shadows of old battles. She spoke of Greening with a politeness that was almost detached. Once, she said, her late husband and Greening had found themselves on opposite sides of a college dispute. She described it as trivial, yet the very precision with which she said trivial suggested the wound had once cut deeper. She poured me a glass of sherry and asked, almost idly, whether I enjoyed my work. I told her it depended on the day. She smiled at that, though the smile did not reach her eyes. By evening, I had returned to my rooms, the notes scattered before me like fragments of some puzzle missing half its pieces. Clara's hesitation, Dacre's fleeting irritation, Fenton's clumsy evasion, Margaret's guarded courtesy, all of them presented surfaces smooth enough to pass inspection, yet none quite convincing. Oxford lives are built on layers: reputation, learning, loyalty, pride. Beneath those layers there is always something else, usually older, usually darker. I looked again at the access register from the camera. Greening's name, written in his own precise hand. The two names above his were scrawled in haste, as if the signatories were eager to be elsewhere. I found myself studying the ink, its faint smudge, where a sleeve had brushed too soon across the page. A minor detail, easily overlooked, but it returned to me that night as if the page itself whispered the truth. Haste conceals more than it reveals. The city lay quiet outside my window, the rain easing at last. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, the crossword beside me, half completed. A clue lingered unanswered. Who hides in plain sight? I left the space blank, knowing Oxford would provide the answer soon enough. There is a particular silence to libraries after dusk, a silence that feels less like absence than accumulation. One hears the faint shuffle of papers, the sigh of timber that has endured too many winters, the breath of scholars who believe themselves unnoticed. It was in such stillness that I found myself again in the Radcliffe camera, the circle of shelves closing around me like the rings of a tree, each layer preserving its own secret season. Lewis trailed behind me, his tread heavier than the place deserved. He asked, not without irritation, what I expected to find that had been missed already. I told him only that it is never the obvious that betrays a man, but the thing set slightly askew. He shrugged, and I think he doubted whether I truly knew what I meant. Perhaps I doubted it myself. On Greening's desk lay the access log, the same as before, but less innocent now. His signature, small and exact like the man. Above it, two others, larger, impatient, one blotted by the careless sweep of a coat. I traced the ink with my finger and found it still faintly granular, though days had passed. Some inks fade differently, depending on the pen, the hand, the haste. I made a note to compare them later, though I half suspected the paper itself might yield more than the names inscribed upon it. Beside the log rested a folio, an unwieldy thing bound in darkened calfskin. It had been returned to the shelf, yet not to the correct place. Lewis, with a touch of pride, pointed out the discrepancy. I pretended not to notice his satisfaction, though it was well deserved. The catalogue number on the spine placed it 3 shelves higher, among sermons of a century earlier. Yet here it lay, near volumes of astronomy. I asked him to imagine a man lifting such a weight, fumbling it back in haste, too preoccupied to care for order. He said that it might be nothing. I agreed that it might be everything. A note of Milton had been scribbled in the margin, faint pencil against older ink. The line was familiar, but wrong by a single word. Not the slip of a man like Greening, who lived by the exactness of quotation. I remembered a crossword clue from the week before, Paradise Corrupted, and had filled in the answer as Eden. Now I wondered whether the puzzle had been more than coincidence. The librarian, Clara, appeared at my side, her movements so precise that I had not heard her approach. She asked if we had need of anything further. I asked whether Greening often wrote in the margins of borrowed texts. She shook her head with an authority that left no room for doubt. He abhorred such defacements, she said. He once reported a student for penciling a single question mark beside a disputed passage. That memory was delivered with something like admiration, though shaded by another feeling I could not quite name. I walked among the shelves then, alone. The wood smelled of polish, the air of ancient paper. Above, the dome gathered the faint echoes of every footfall and returned them as if they belonged to someone else. I bent to inspect a lower shelf, and the floor complained beneath my weight, a groan like an old man remembering a grievance. I thought of Greening, seated here at night, the lamplight exposing his face in half shadows, the silence pressing upon him. What had he sought among these alien subjects? Astronomy, correspondence, theology far from his own. Was he chasing a truth or fleeing one? As we left, Lewis remarked that the camera was no place to die. I told him, perhaps more to myself, that it was as fitting a place as any, a circle of books around a man who had lived among them, the world narrowed to parchment and ink. Yet even there, amid that sanctity of scholarship, I could feel the disturbance left by hands too hurried, words too casually altered, a volume displaced not by accident, but by design, small things almost nothing at all. But I have learned that it is in such nothings that truth begins to take shape. It was Lewis who first mentioned the letters. He had the look of a man half apologizing for his own discovery, as though bringing me such tidings might itself be an intrusion. They had been tucked inside one of the college archives, folded with unnecessary care, their edges creased in a manner that suggested too many readings. He told me they bore Greening's initials and that the handwriting matched well enough to persuade a casual eye. The implication was plain enough, an affair discreet but real between Greening and Clara Ashbury. I read them in the gloaming of my office, the rain making a fretful percussion against the window. The first spoke of shared evenings in the camera, of confidences exchanged over manuscripts, of some private intimacy more easily conducted in silence than in words. Another hinted at longing, cloaked in the language of books returned and volumes misplaced, as though desire itself could be disguised in cataloguing. They were neither crude nor clumsy. Indeed, there was something almost elegant in their concealment. But elegance does not equal truth. Lewis asked if I believed them. He was young enough, or perhaps decent enough, to want the world's secrets to align with its appearances. I told him that Greening had many qualities, but I had never considered him a romantic. Lewis shrugged, muttering that men are capable of more than we suspect. He was right, of course. Still, something in those letters rang false to me. I thought of Clara, her precision, the way she aligned the edges of her blotter, as though untidiness were a sin. Could such a woman allow her private life to be laid bare with so little circumspection? When I had asked her of Greening, her pause before affectionate had been long, but not longing. There is a difference. The misgiving returned when I noticed a line quoted in one of the letters. It was from Milton again, or rather a version of Milton. The substitution of one word for another, a small thing, almost invisible, betrayed an ear less exacting than Greening's. He would never have tolerated the corruption of a line he knew by heart. I had seen it once already, penciled in the margin of the misshelved folio. Too neat a repetition, too careless for a man so exact. That night I poured myself more whiskey than was wise and unfolded the crossword still waiting on my desk. A clue stared at me, lover's deceit. 6 letters. I wrote in the answer quickly, almost without thought. Forgery. The pencil line bit too hard into the paper, but I left it there. The next morning I sought Clara once more, finding her alone among the stacks. She looked at me with something between fatigue and defiance, when I asked if she knew of the letters. She said she had heard rumours, nothing more. Her lips pressed together as she insisted that she and Greening were friends, nothing beyond that. I believed her, though belief in Oxford is rarely safe. Lewis, meanwhile, was less convinced. He pointed out that the timing of the letters matched Greening's visits to the camera. He reminded me of the access register, the names entered one after another, the hurried blot of ink. He said it was all too neat to be coincidence. I told him it was precisely the neatness that troubled me. Human affairs, in my experience, are never so carefully aligned. Later, alone in the camera once more, I studied the shelves where Greening had sat. The faint impression of his spectacles lingered on the blotting paper, like the ghost of a man still reading. I thought of him, alone in the circle of books, perhaps laughing softly at the absurdity of passion conducted through borrowed texts, or perhaps never laughing at all. The affair might have satisfied as explanation. It offered motive, secrecy, the tangled loyalties Oxford thrives upon, yet the forged cadence of that quotation, the faint echo of a careless hand, where Greening's would have been meticulous, told me otherwise. Someone wanted us to believe in romance where none had existed, and in that invention lay the first true shadow of intent. When I left the camera, the evening bells were tolling again, their notes blurred by drizzle. I carried the letters in my coat pocket, their paper damp with the city's moisture, their words heavy with invention. A false trail, yes, but one laid with such care that I could not help but wonder what deeper truth it was meant to obscure. There are days when I wonder whether the dons of Oxford speak more to hear themselves than to enlighten others. Professor Dacre was in full voice that afternoon, his lecture room half lit by a reluctant sun filtering through high windows, the chalk dust clinging to his sleeve like a pale mist. I had slipped into the back row, content to be mistaken for an inattentive scholar rather than an inquisitor. Lewis sat beside me, uncomfortable in a seat too narrow for him, his notes untouched. Dacre's subject was Milton, though to hear him tell it, the poet's greatness lay chiefly in his resemblance to Dacre himself. He paced before the blackboard, quoting long passages with a theatrical gravity, pausing for the student's admiration. Yet when he came to a familiar line, a line I had known since boyhood, he altered a word. Just a single word, replaced with something easier on the tongue, but wrong all the same. The misquotation barely ruffled his audience. A few scribbled it down faithfully. Others stared through him with the indifference of youth. But I felt the change like a discordant note in a symphony, for it was the same error I had seen in the letters and again in the penciled margin of that misplaced folio. A thread too thin to convince anyone else, yet strong enough to tug at me with unwelcome insistence. I scribbled the altered line in the margin of my own notebook beside the unfinished crossword I carried everywhere. That day's clue read, imperfect echo, 5 letters. I wrote in the word shadow. It seemed fitting. Lewis shifted, whispering whether I had dragged him here for a poetry recital. I told him, quietly, that sometimes a misquoted poet says more than the speaker intends. He frowned, asked whether I was suggesting Dacre had forged the letters. I reminded him that deduction is not a straight road, but a corridor with many locked doors. You try the handles one by one. The lecture dragged on, sentences swelling with Dacre's self-importance, until at last the hour tolled from St. Mary's spire, and the students began their ritual of escape. Chairs scraped, notebooks snapped shut, the air filled with the relief of release. I remained seated, waiting until the hall had thinned to silence. When I approached him, Dacre greeted me with the geniality of a man who mistakes scrutiny for flattery. He asked if I had enjoyed the performance. I replied that I had enjoyed the poet. He smiled thinly at that. When I mentioned Greening's name, the smile faltered. He claimed to have admired the man, to have respected his devotion to scholarship. Yet the phrase came rehearsed, like the line of a play he had spoken too often. His eyes strayed briefly to his notes, as though some reminder lurked there. It was then that my pocket rattled. The phone. Stranger's voice, brusque, demanding to know why progress was slow, why the death had not already been consigned to paperwork. I listened without interruption, my gaze fixed on Dacre, who had turned away with the faint impatience of a man unaccustomed to waiting for anyone. When I ended the call, he was gone. Outside, the quadrangle lay washed in a light drizzle, the paving stones slick, the air cool with the smell of wet ivy. Lewis muttered that we had gained little, that I was chasing shadows. Perhaps he was right. Yet the wrong word in that lecture lingered like an aftertaste, binding together letters, margins, and now a voice. Small errors, perhaps, but in Oxford truth is rarely betrayed by what is said correctly. That evening, with a glass of claret warming my hand, I copied the altered quotation once more, setting it beside the crossword clue I had solved. Shadow. The word seemed to follow me around the room, growing larger as the light dimmed. A man may hide behind many masks, but the shadow he casts will betray him in the end. It was Lewis who brought me the diary, though I suspect he had not meant to discover it at all. He had been trawling through boxes in the college archives looking for committee minutes when the leather spine presented itself like an intruder among duller company. He handed it to me with the half-apologetic air of a man who feared it might be nothing. I knew before I opened it that it would be something. The book was brittle, its edges flaking under my touch. Inside, the hand was youthful, uncertain at first, but steadier as the pages passed. A student's diary from the late 50s. I read aloud the first entry that caught me. Rumours, whispers of disgrace, a hearing before the governing body. The student had been expelled for conduct unbecoming, the euphemism always more damning than the truth. Presiding over the hearing, the diary noted, was none other than Dr. Alistair Greening. Lewis muttered that the name meant little now. I reminded him that Oxford has the memory of an elephant, but chooses when to recall. I turned another page. There was bitterness here, anger, barely cooled by ink. A line that struck me most, one day they will answer for their hypocrisy. The phrase underlined twice, as though to secure its endurance. We traced the surname easily enough. A family of some standing, though their fortunes had declined in the intervening decades, and there it was, like a quiet bell struck in the distance, Margaret Vale. The expelled student had been her brother. I found myself walking to her house that evening, dusk settling in as lightly as ash. She received me with that same courtesy as before, the elegance of a woman who has long practiced restraint. I mentioned the diary only obliquely, watching her carefully. For the first time her composure wavered. She looked past me to the garden beyond the window, her lips pressed thin, as if the memory itself carried a taste she had long sought to forget. She said her brother had been wild, foolish, incapable of living by rules, designed for men of sterner fibre. Greening, she added, had taken particular satisfaction in his downfall. She did not forgive easily, that much was clear, but whether resentment endured into action was another matter. On my way back through the dripping streets, I tried to recall every look, every hesitation. Margaret had poured me sherry once before, this time she did not. Instead, she asked whether justice, in my profession, was ever truly just. I told her that it depended on who held the scales. She did not answer, but her silence lingered longer than any reply might have. Later that night, alone at my desk, I reopened the diary. The entries grew more erratic toward the end, ink smudged by hurried fingers. There was one note about a letter sent to Greening himself, a letter accusing him of hypocrisy, of cowardice, masked as principle. Whether the letter was ever received, the diary did not say, but I remembered Clara's remark that Greening read certain letters twice, searching for meanings beyond the obvious. Was this one of them? The crossword that evening mocked me with a clue. Hidden grievance, 7 letters. I tried vengeance, but it failed to fit. At last, I settled on rancor, the word crouching on the page like something waiting in the dark. It suited both the diary and the woman who had smiled at me without warmth. Lewis thought the matter plain enough. A grudge from the past carried forward by a sister determined to settle her brother's debt. He reminded me of her late husband's quarrel with Greening, of the bitterness that seemed to cling to her name. He was eager to draw the line straight, but life rarely permits such tidy geometry. The city was restless that night, rain drumming on the tiles, bicycles clattering over wet cobbles. In my rooms, I poured another whiskey, the diary open beside me, its pages breathing out a faint smell of mould and dust. A past unearthed, yes. But the question remained, had it been unearthed by me or by someone else first, someone who had used its bitterness as tinder for darker flames? I closed the book, though the words continued to echo. Oxford endures, but memory never truly sleeps. The discovery of the draft will came to me by way of a solicitor with the complexion of paper left too long in a damp drawer. He called it an irregularity, though his tone carried the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found something certain amid the general fog. The document itself was unsigned, folded into a battered envelope, its ink slightly blurred, as if the writer's hand had pressed too heavily in moments of emphasis. It suggested that Greening intended to bequeath his papers, his notes, perhaps even his modest collection of first editions, not to the college, but to Clara Ashbury. A gesture which in Oxford's economy of favours and grudges could not be read as anything but scandalous. Lewis reacted with a predictability that made me almost fond of him. "There's motive enough, sir." She stood to gain by it. Perhaps Greening changed his mind. Perhaps she found out and pressed him. He spoke as though murder were the natural currency of inheritance. I read the will in silence, running my eyes again and again over the phrasing. At first glance it was neat, persuasive even. Yet there was something in the cadence of its Latin codicil, a line meant to solemnize the bequest, that troubled me. The word order was clumsy, inelegant. Greening, pedant of pedants, would have corrected it at once. Later that evening I unfolded my crossword. A clue read, "Error in solemn speech, 4 letters." The answer came without hesitation, slip. I penciled it in, though the word seemed too modest for what lay in front of me. The will circulated quickly enough among the fellows. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. The thought of the college's inheritance diminished, of Clara enriched by a man's sudden generosity, was enough to set the common room buzzing like a disturbed hive. I walked among them, hearing the veiled comments, devotion rewarded, loyalty purchased, affection acknowledged, all the euphemisms of men who enjoy scandal more than they admit. I visited Clara the next day. She was pale, more so than usual, and her precision seemed sharpened, as if she were determined to master her surroundings before they betrayed her. She admitted nothing, denied nothing. When I asked if she knew of the will, her fingers paused an instant too long on the edge of a catalogue card. She said she had not, but the denial carried a hollowness, as though she no longer cared whether I believed her. Lewis pressed me again. If she stood to gain, it was clear. But I reminded him that in Oxford, clarity is often the disguise. I asked him to read the Latin phrase aloud. He stumbled on the word order, and I saw the same clumsiness I had marked before. Whoever wrote that draft was not Greening. They were imitating his voice, but like a counterfeit coin, the weight betrayed them. That night the city was heavy with mist, the lamps bleeding halos onto wet stone. I carried the will in my coat pocket, the paper softening in the damp. I thought of Greening, the man of margins and corrections, suddenly abandoning precision to declare such generosity. Impossible. And yet the forgery had been subtle enough to persuade many. Perhaps that was the point, to persuade just long enough to redirect suspicion. I returned to my rooms with the bells tolling at midnight. The crossword lay open still, the word slip staring back at me. I poured myself a whiskey, listening to the faint hum of the city as though it might answer questions unasked. The will was false. I knew it, as one knows a discordant note in familiar music. But false trails, I reminded myself, are often laid with greater care than truths. And someone, careful, hasty, both at once, wanted me to believe in Clara's guilt. I closed my eyes then, the taste of smoke on my tongue, the sound of rain against the glass. False trails are dangerous, not because they mislead, but because they tempt you to wish they were true. It was late when I returned once more to the Radcliffe camera, though late in Oxford never truly means silence. There are always footsteps echoing faintly on the cobbles, the soft murmur of students debating something neither of them will remember by dawn, the bells insisting on their supremacy over all human conversation. Yet inside the camera, past the oak doors and their long groan of protest, the air was still enough to betray the smallest interruption. I carried the access register with me, its pages soft from too many hands, though only a few lines marked the night Greening died. I had studied it before more than once, but that evening I forced myself to read it as though for the first time, tracing each name as if the letters themselves contained intent. Greening's signature, small, neat, unhurried. Above it, two others. The second hurried, a pen pressed too firmly, leaving a blot where the tail of a letter had snagged in haste. Edward Fenton. I had noticed the blot before, but only in the careless way one notices rain on glass. Present, irrelevant. That night I touched the ink again, faintly raised still, as though it had not dried evenly. It was a minor detail, almost nothing, but nothing has a way of clinging to me until I yield. Lewis joined me at the table, his bulk making the chair creak. He asked what I hoped to find in names we had already seen. I told him that repetition is not futility, that one must circle back until the circle begins to reveal its centre. He shook his head, said I liked my metaphors too much. Perhaps. Yet metaphors have solved more crimes than blunt fact ever did. The blot itself told me little, but it reminded me of Fenton's earlier evasions, his debts, his indifference, the smell of stale brandy in his rooms. I remembered, too, his awkwardness with Greek, a don in name, but a scholar whose foundations were shakier than he dared admit. The forged will, the altered letters, the Milton quotation with its misplaced word. Each error had been the error of a man who knew just enough to imitate knowledge but not enough to avoid betrayal. I pulled from my pocket the crossword I had carried all week, now crumpled, rain-spotted. One clue remained, careless mistake, 6 letters. I filled it in without hesitation, blunder, and there it was, the letters, the will, the penciled quotation, all blunders masquerading as brilliance. Still, I told myself, caution, coincidence dresses itself well in Oxford. The city thrives on mistaken identities, on plausible shadows. Yet the ink under my finger, stubborn in its imperfection, whispered something different. Later I walked back across the quadrangle, Lewis beside me, the stones gleaming with rain. He asked whether I thought Fenton capable of violence. I said that men are rarely capable until the moment they are. He muttered about motive, about money, about desperation. I reminded him that desperation is motive enough. The night grew heavier, the air thick with the smell of damp stone. In my rooms I poured whiskey, though it gave little comfort. I laid the register beside the crossword, the word blunder staring up at me with quiet insistence. I thought of Greening, meticulous, precise, a man unlikely to forgive such carelessness. Perhaps he had threatened exposure, perhaps only hinted. And perhaps Fenton, fearing the collapse of a career built on fragile pretense, had acted rashly in a room where silence itself might have been witness. Yet nothing was certain, only the blot of ink, the hurried scrawl, the faint shadow of impatience pressed into paper. A minor detail. Too minor, perhaps, for others to notice. But I had built my life on such details, on the small, stubborn marks left by human folly. The city outside had quieted at last. I sat alone, the bells long past midnight, staring at the page until the ink seemed to swell in the dim light. And I thought, not for the first time, that truth rarely arrives in triumph. More often it comes in the form of a smudge, a hesitation, a word misspoken. Small things fragile, but in the end unendurable. It was in the camera, fittingly enough, that the last veil shifted. Circles within circles, books pressed against their neighbours, as though time itself leaned on them. I had brought Lewis there late in the evening, when most of the students had already surrendered their places to the lure of warmth and noise elsewhere. The lamps hummed faintly, the smell of parchment and polish drifting down like incense. Edward Fenton arrived as though summoned by accident. His coat damp with drizzle, his tie poorly knotted, the impatience in his step too loud for that sanctuary of silence. He saw me seated at the long oak table and faltered, only briefly, but long, enough for me to notice. Lewis shifted beside me, waiting for my cue. I asked him to sit. He obeyed, reluctantly, the scrape of the chair echoing more than it should. He muttered something about bad timing, about papers to be marked, debts to be settled. He spoke quickly, too quickly, the words colliding with one another. I let him continue until the rhythm of his excuses grew frantic, and I placed the access register before him. His name, ink blotted, glistened still in my memory, though the page had long dried. He looked down, then away. I told him that haste leaves traces, that even ink remembers the anxiety of the hand that shaped it. His lips parted as if to protest, but no sound followed. Lewis leaned forward, heavy with accusation, but I raised a hand to still him. This was not a matter for force. Truth, like wine, must breathe before it reveals itself. I asked about the forged letters, the draft will, the Milton misquotation. Each, I said, was clever, almost convincing, but marred by a small blunder. A word misplaced, a cadence untrue, a slip in the Latin that betrayed more ignorance than erudition. Greening would never have forgiven such errors. Perhaps that was why he had threatened exposure. Fenton shifted again, his hand brushing the folio nearest him. He said I had no proof. I replied that proof is often nothing more than the smallest of shadows repeated until it forms a shape. He laughed, though without humour, and the sound died against the dome. Lewis asked outright if he had killed Greening. Fenton did not answer at once. Instead, he ran his fingers along the spine of the book before him, tracing the gilded letters as though they might lend him courage. He whispered finally that Greening had ruined him, that the man had promised silence and then threatened betrayal. The debts, the plagiarized footnotes, the career already built on sand. He said he had not meant for death to come, only for quiet. But quiet, like truth, is rarely under our control. I did not record his words, not then. They remain with me still, not as evidence, but as confession half drowned in remorse. Lewis wrote his notes diligently, the sound of pencil against paper sharp in the stillness. I looked at Fenton, a young man grown older too soon, undone less by malice than by fear. In Oxford, fear of exposure can prove deadlier than hatred itself. When he was led away, I remained in the camera. The circle of shelves loomed above me, their silence both consoling and condemning. I opened the crossword once more, the final clue unsolved. End without glory, 7 letters. I filled it in at last. Failure. The words seemed to bleed into the page, heavier than ink. The lamps flickered as I closed the book. Outside, the bells struck the hour with patient indifference. And I thought, as I so often have, that Oxford preserves more than learning in its stones. It preserves the echoes of ambition, pride, and folly, all those human frailties, bound as tightly as the volumes that guard them. The college settled itself with remarkable speed once the scandal was neatly contained. Dons returned to their lectures, students to their essays, and the common room chatter shifted back to wine allowances and the inadequacy of the heating. Oxford, like the river that skirts it, prefers to flow around obstacles rather than confront them. A man could be arrested under the shadow of the Radcliffe camera, and within a fortnight his name would be spoken only in lowered tones, like an embarrassing misprint in a prize list. Lewis was pleased, of course. He had that solid satisfaction of a man whose work has yielded an answer, however bleak. He said it had been a good result, that we had got there in the end. I did not disagree, though the words tasted of ash. I found Clara once more in the library. She stood by the catalogue desk, as straight and precise as when I had first seen her. She asked me politely whether the matter was concluded. I said that it was. Her eyes, pale and steady, searched mine a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned back to her papers. I noticed how her hands did not tremble, even when she thought herself unobserved. She was a woman who had built her life upon quiet fortitude, and I envied her that armour. Margaret Vale sent me a note, a brief line written in an elegant, slanting hand. She thanked me for what she called the resolution of an unhappy business. No flourish, no sentiment, merely a courteous acknowledgment, as though she had been compelled to write by convention more than gratitude. When I saw her a week later at a concert in the Sheldonian, she inclined her head in greeting but did not speak. The music, Brahms, I think, swallowed the space between us. I told myself that her silence was her final verdict, though I could not say whether it was on Greening, on Fenton, or on me. In the evenings, when the rain pattered softly against the glass of my rooms, I returned to the crossword. One clue had resisted me for days. Eternal circle, 8 letters. I tried endlessly, stays, rotation, infinity, unending. None would fit. It was only when I laid aside my pencil in irritation that the answer arrived, unbidden, as if whispered by the city itself. Eternity. The letters slid into place with maddening ease, as though the puzzle had merely waited for me to surrender my impatience. Fenton's words in the camera still haunted me. He had not spoken like a villain, but like a man cornered by his own fabrications, desperate to hold together a life already fractured. His confession carried less malice than exhaustion. I could not help but feel that Oxford itself had undone him. The expectation of brilliance, the fear of disgrace, the illusion that one false step could ruin a lifetime. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps one false step is enough. Strange congratulated me with that brusque authority of his, telling me I had shown my usual flair. I listened, nodded, and wished silently that Flair felt less like failure. For what had we achieved? A young man's life destroyed, an older man buried, and a college eager to sweep the dust beneath its carpets. Justice, perhaps, but hardly triumph. One evening, walking home past the Radcliffe camera, I paused. The dome glowed faintly under the street lamps, its circle serene against the night sky. Students hurried past with laughter in their throats, their voices rising like smoke into the darkness. I watched them until they disappeared around the corner, and I thought of Greening, of Fenton, of Clara and Margaret, their lives, their choices, all drawn into that circle, and me among them, no less flawed, no less captive. Back in my rooms, I poured another measure of whiskey, though it did little to soften the weight of reflection. The crossword lay complete on my desk, every square filled, every clue answered. Yet as I stared at it, I felt only a strange hollowness, as though the solving of puzzles mattered little once the human cost was tallied. Oxford, for all its beauty, is a city that feeds on secrets. It stores them in its libraries, buries them in its quadrangles, murmurs them beneath its bells, and sometimes, when the rain is heavy and the night too long, I wonder whether those secrets seep into the very stones, binding us all in a silence we mistake for permanence. I finish my glass, the final word of the crossword whispering at the edge of thought, eternity. Not a comfort, not a promise, but a reminder that nothing is truly resolved, not in Oxford, not in life. The city at dusk has always unsettled me. Oxford grows quieter but never still, as though its stones keep their own counsel long after the students and scholars have withdrawn. That evening, walking alone beneath the mellow lamps of Radcliffe Square, I felt the weight of conclusion pressing on me. Not triumph, not even relief, but something more uncertain, like the faint chill that follows rain. Greening was buried, Fenton condemned, Clara withdrawn into her fortress of catalogues, Margaret into her silence. The camera stood where it always had, round and unyielding, indifferent to the lives it had gathered and discarded. I paused outside its locked doors, the smell of damp stone rising in the night air, and thought of circles again. Not the clean geometry of mathematics, but the human kind. Grudges that loop endlessly, griefs that bend back upon themselves, mistakes that recur under different names. Strange had said the case was tidy. He liked tidy things. I wondered if he had ever opened a book in that circular library, seen the marginalia, the smudged notes, the ink blots. There is nothing tidy about human history, nothing final about truth. Even Fenton's confession had felt less like a revelation than resignation. He had spoken not as a murderer, but as a man exhausted by his own invention, longing for someone else to finish the story he could no longer sustain. Back in my rooms, I poured a glass of whiskey, the crossword folded before me. The final clue, circle without end, 7 letters, had lingered unanswered for days. Tonight, almost reluctantly, I penciled in the obvious, forever. The word sat heavy on the page, unremarkable yet inescapable, like the city itself. Lewis had gone back to his family, content, I think, to let the case recede into the blur of his working life. He told me he admired my persistence, though I heard in his tone the faint impatience of a man who longs for certainty where none can exist. I envied him his simplicity, his ability to close a file without hearing the echoes it leaves behind. The bells of St. Mary's began their slow chime, each note expanding into the night, until it dissolved into nothing. I thought of Greening in his final moments, alone among the shelves, the dome pressing its silence upon him. Did he sense what was coming? Or was it as sudden as the extinguishing of a lamp, his thoughts breaking off mid-sentence, mid-quotation? Such questions never yield answers. and yet they follow me more faithfully than any solution. Margaret's eyes returned to me in memory, not angry, not even sorrowful, but distant, as though she had measured the world and found it wanting. Clara, too, her composure immaculate, her loyalties buried in silence. Both of them had lived with shadows longer than I had. My intrusion had altered nothing of their lives, only drawn their grief into sharper relief. I walked once more to the window. The city stretched out in muted greys. Students hurried by, their laughter rising, then breaking against the stone. I thought how little they knew, and how fortunate. Their circles were still unbroken, their puzzles still unsolved. They did not yet understand that some solutions come too late to matter, and others come only to remind us of what cannot be undone. I finished my whiskey, the taste lingering like an unfinished line of verse. On the desk, the crossword lay completed, though its answers gave me no peace. The word forever stared up, indifferent, inevitable. Some secrets, I told myself, are never solved, only endured. And Oxford, with its domes and quadrangles, its endless turning of circles, knows that better than any of us.